Pattern language is a remarkable effort to facilitate a way of envisioning a place that one wants to make. Pattern language is a method, keeping the whole in sight, to begin to see what architectural and environmental parts that whole should bring forward. How is it that the world is always present around me? It seemed to be a kind of miracle, that wherever I am, I'm surrounded by a world. It's essentially environmental serendipity, that so much of happy things in life happen because of coincidental meetings in place. So you're walking down the sidewalk and you meet an old friend you haven't seen in 6 months, and you go for coffee, and something very important happens out of that event. Place release is a very useful way to get ordinary people thinking about the significance of place in their lives. Because you say to somebody, okay, well, now just think about this for a little bit. Can you think of a serendipitous event that happened because of place? And it's remarkable what people come up with.
It is.
So many folks met their significant other this way. Human being is not human being alone. Human being is human being in place. And if we can recognize this new way of realizing what we are, we realize that an integral part of place is the others in the place. So I do think it's a different vision. And I think it's related to what you're attempting to do with your cognitive work. What is your expression? Waymaking?
Yeah.
And that's part of it too, that who we are is the way we make our way. That moment on the plank had to do with realizing that there was a way to see accurately, a way of understanding something real. And it's that wish to really understand in a real way that's driven me along my entire professional career.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. As you know, if you've listened to any other episode, I'm a little bit obsessed with a few things. And one of those is the way that space and place are connected to self, identity, mind, whatever word you want to put in there. The parameters of our consciousness, of our cognition, of our emotion. I think about that a lot philosophically, of course, in my work, but also practically in terms of the vehicles we create and the cities we make and things like this. And through that work and research, I came across David Seamon some years ago and his work, and we've had some discussions about things over the years, about different ideas of placemaking, this notion of place ballet, and especially about a man named Christopher Alexander, who wrote a book called A Pattern Language, which I hope you've all heard of, and if you haven't, I really highly suggest you check it out. Christopher Alexander was an architect and became something of a philosopher. I came across him first because of object-oriented programming in computer software, because weirdly, but not so weirdly once you dig into it, a lot of that was inspired by some of his ideas, and he even had this idea of trying to create more holistic, or that's not even the right word, to create computer programs that had wholeness in it, which is a very special word that David and I talk about here. But the root of it all has to do with space and place and the order of that and the patterns of that. For example, when we design a city or we come into a new space and we want to create something in that space, instead of just imposing a bunch of new angles and buildings and containers and parts into that area, what if we sit with it a moment and notice it and look at its own patterns? Because there's already patterns to that space, no matter how natural, organic, or busy, or full of animals or birds or humans it is. As it is, it already has some sort of pattern. And Alexander's work shows us how to just sort of sit and observe and notice that, and then find a way to dance with it. I don't think he uses that idea of dancing, but it feels like that to me, of finding the organic or ongoing dynamical patterns of that space and designing with them It's almost an Aikido kind of approach to architecture. And David is also talking about place and coming at it, thinking about phenomenology in similar ways, that everything has a pattern and there's an awareness and a sensitivity that we can cultivate, and then we begin to notice that pattern and build with it instead of against it. And it's this idea that the feeling and the place, or the life and the place, are not distinguishable. So it's a very different kind of understanding of space and place, and even of phenomenology, as David and I talk about, because he introduces that word in a different way into geography. But the main idea is this word wholeness, and a paper that David recently wrote, I think in March 2024, is about Christopher Alexander's work and the way of wholeness. And if you know my work at all, you know I like this word, way. And Christopher Alexander uses it a lot too, and so does David. So in this paper, The Way of Wholeness, looking at Christopher Alexander's work, David talks about analytic relationality and synergistic relationality. And to sort of caricature it too much, David does better in the paper, so I hope you'll just read it. But the analytic is like taking things apart, looking at the parts instead of the process. And the synergistic is more of what I was trying to explain with Alexander's approach, where there's a relationality that's in synergy and it's ongoing, and you can envision places as this interconnected field or vector or pattern of intertwined relationships that sort of gather there in an intimacy. So we talk about that paper, and we talk about Alexander, and we just talk about what space really is and what place is for us. David brings up how a lot of people met their partners, their husbands or their wives or their best friends because of some kind of weird serendipity of being in some place at the right time. I met my husband that way too, and once you start thinking about these moments in your life, you realize how important place is to those memories and also to those events occurring at all. And the deeper you kind of go into the nestedness of it, you realize you can't distinguish those events from place. I mean, they were never distinguishable from place. And I think Alexander is also trying to get us to do this in a way to realize that there's a kind of presencing of the whole in each part. That might even be his term, or maybe it's David's term. But in a lot of the people that I've worked with, thought about, read, worked towards understanding, it has to do with holding this seeming paradox of there being a part and a whole, and thinking of place and human and being and beings in general that are that place as not separate but intertwined. And David has studied with a lot of people who think about wholeness in a very specific way, and we talk about them, and David's continuing in that tradition. And these people aren't people that everyone has heard of in the field of geography, certainly not in the field of philosophy. They're sort of at the edges, or what David says, the periphery, and he's kind of annoyed by that, and I can understand why. Because, as I think Christopher Alexander says himself in some movie or other, it's almost like the simplest thing, this kind of message that we are place, and place changes as we change, and the experience of place changes as we change our presence. And yet, it's like, as Alexander says, and as David says here, I think it's the thing that nobody really is paying attention to. I mean, I'm from the United States, and you drive down most roads there, and it's just piles of kind of weird, ugly signs. There's not a rhythm and a pattern that makes you feel good about those places, but there could be. And I can't go into all of Alexander's work, but he really shows how to think about all these places of everyday life, and how if we just took a moment and looked at it, the way we arrange and design things like signs and buildings, we could actually have a very different experience of being in the world. And this translates into our relationships with ourselves and others. But I think the important thing is just that David Seamon, who I talked to here, he's a student of these people like Christopher Alexander and Henri Bortoft, who try to think about wholeness in a different way. Goethe, too, the German poet, playwright, we talk about a bit here, and David Bohm, who I wrote an early thesis on. There's all these people who seem to be trying to give us the same sense of the practice of wholeness, of understanding it as a practice. And so David and I try to unpack this more here, and mostly we talk about some important terms that help us understand how important place is in our lives and how important Alexander's work is. I'm pretty new to it. I've only been really reading him for a few years, and there's people who've been reading him for decades, but I hope more and more people will, and also read David's work, because he's also been doing a lot of good things towards helping us better understand place. So thank you for being here. I'll link to all this in the show notes, and I hope you're doing really well out there in this world as you're making your way, and that you take a moment somewhere and notice the rhythms around you and dance with them a bit today. Hi, David. Thanks so much for being on the show today. It's so great to see you.
It's a pleasure.
Today, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but I think I want to focus on or go into it through this paper of yours that was recently published called Ways of Understanding Wholeness, Place, Christopher Alexander, and Synergistic Relationality. So of all those words, let's start with wholeness. That's been a word that's meant a lot to you through your whole career. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about when that word first came into your life, and we can go from there maybe a bit.
Well, I grew up in upstate New York, in a very rural part of upstate New York. And being in nature was always very important for me as a child. And I think my interest in wholeness developed one afternoon in the summer when I was lying on a plank which went over a small creek which was next to our house. And I was filled with this question: how is it that the world is always present around me? In that moment, it seemed to be a kind of miracle, that wherever I am, I'm surrounded by a world. Now, obviously, the world changes, but it's always there. It's like reflections in the mirror, nobody makes them happen, and yet they're instantly there always. It's really quite a magical phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the starting point for my work, wishing to find descriptive ways of understanding what this lived intertwinement, enmeshment, immersion in the world is about. And over time, that led me to a doctorate in geography, because geography as a discipline is a very interesting area of investigation, because it is the study of human beings in the world, essentially, their relationship to the earth. And it was through encountering geography, and I did my doctoral work at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is one of the major centers for geographical research. And back in the 1970s, when I was doing my dissertation work, there was a young geographer there named Anne Bodemer. And Anne Bodemer became part of a tradition which eventually was called humanistic geography. Now, I don't know, have you looked into that literature? Fascinating literature.
It is.
Like Yves Foutoin and Edward Relph and Anne Bodemer. And it was Anne who introduced me to phenomenology.
Okay.
Because that was the time in all the social sciences when there was a reaction against quantification and a positivist approach, analytic approach to social science research. And there was an effort to move in new directions. So you had the Marxism, you had the post-structuralism, and what took my fancy was phenomenology. And I still remember clearly how awestruck I was when I learned about phenomenology, because as a graduate student, one of my most disappointing discoveries was the way these so-called researchers manhandled the world. They decided beforehand what independent and dependent variables they were going to look at, and then they structured the world that they were researching through that predetermined structure. And it seemed to me so unfair to the world. It seemed to me that so much of social science, especially, was not really finding ways to encounter what experience was about, what meaning was about, what life was about.
So that didn't explain that feeling you had lying on the plank, so to speak, like just to relate it to
Yes,
that.
of course, that was underlying this feeling that what most social science was getting at was a kind of unreality grounded in the manipulative cerebral work of the researcher.
Is that because that little boy on the plank, right, having this kind of moment, which many of us have had, where everything sudden. I had it. I think. How old were you, by the way, when you had that?
Probably 6.
Okay. I think I was a little older, but like lying in the yard at night, one of my teachers had said for homework, you have to go lie down and look at the stars. And it was that kind of moment like you described. But so as I'm here, as you're describing this educational world, would they have tried to look at that place and sort of take it apart and put it into bits or something? Like, how would they try to explain that experience in a way? Because it sounds like it was taking that apart in a way that it was taking the best part of the experience out of it or something.
Well, you see, at that point, geographers were largely focused on the material world. So, studying the spatial distribution of language, for example, or studying a particular house type. But the emphasis was on the world outside the human being. You know, in those days, you were not allowed to talk about how the geographical world could be experienced by human beings. That was very much a non-topic.
So
Now,
phenomenology, first person experience, the idea of being in the world was not allowed.
No, it had started.
Okay.
As you know, the work in cognitive science, for example, begins back in the 60s.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is when it reached your world, because I've recently, I came at it the other way and found geography and the way that phenomenology is used in that, and it's very interesting for me, but I don't really yet understand when it started there.
Well, in terms of the phenomenological work, what I'm trying to say is that there were important developments before phenomenology came into the discipline in the 70s. For example, cognitive mapping began in the 60s with people like David Stay and Kevin Lynch. You probably know the early Kevin Lynch work, The Image of the City. So there was a recognition that we had to start looking at values, images, perceptions, understandings. But it was largely explicit. It was largely cerebral, intellectual, cognitive that got the attention. And it was only when the so-called humanistic work began, people like Yves Foutuan and Edward Relph and Ann Buttermer, that we began to realize that the range of human experience in relation to environmental, geographical place topics was so much more than cognitive. For example, Merleau-Ponty and the lived body, and the fact that so much everyday geographical action was grounded in habit and routine. And as you probably know, that became a major theme in my first book, A Geography of the Life World, which was published in 1979 and was a rewrite of my dissertation. So the phenomenological work was so important because it said, we can look at all aspects of the way that human beings experience, find meaning in, have encounter with, are engaged with the environment, with place, with space, with home. And of course, this is another interesting way in which geography is so interesting because it does hold together people and world. In a way that sociology doesn't or psychology doesn't. Each of those disciplines, they sever out the person in some way from the world. Geography is the only discipline, interestingly, that holds the whole structure together. Now, there are very few geographers who realize this, but it's true.
Let me stop you there for a second because, as you know, I'm coming from philosophy and cognitive science, and there's the idea of cognitive being only in the head is something I don't believe anymore. I believe it's in the body and in the world, but this is something that now still when people hear cognitive, they think it means in the brain. So that's interesting when I hear you speak too, because I think of it as phenomenological, but I just needed to say that as a side note. But it sounds like with geography, or what I found, it's starting with the place and environment. So you instead of starting inside or with the brain on one level or the psychology, you already have the world as part of it. So even though, like you're saying, most people haven't linked that first person, the first person is already in it. It's just that people like you sort of started to kind of bring that out or something. Is that a fair way to say? Because I think what you're saying about geography is true, but it might be hard for people to understand what you mean.
Well, I agree with what you say. Of course, one of the curious things about our geographical experience with the world is that, on one hand, as you say, there is a geographical world outside the person. It's a landscape, it's a topography, it's animal life, it's plant life, it's the cultural artifacts that have been constructed in the place. It's all of that. So there is a phenomenology of that world outside the person geographically, but it's also important to understand there's a geographical component inside the person to feel at home, for example. This quality of feeling inside a place that Ted Relph emphasizes so much in his book, Place and Placelessness. So you have this interesting, it gets into your dialectics again. On the one hand, you have the inside. On the other hand, you have the outside. And of course, I'm interested in holding it all together.
Yeah, I was about to
Now,
say, this is where the
you can't
wholeness
hold it all
becomes
together.
very important. Yeah.
So if you look at Relph's work, for example, it emphasizes more the outside. Well, Ted's work is very good because it covers the spectrum, but you can place different researchers in terms of their degree of interest in inside versus outside. But ultimately, it all has to be held together. Now, if we go into Christopher Alexander, the architect, his focus, well, at least originally, was largely the outside and figuring out designable aspects of the material environment that would strengthen one's sense of place and at homeness. And you see that in have you ever looked at his pattern language book?
Oh, sure, yeah. But more from coming at it like software development side.
Well, that's true, but I don't know. This whole software thing, I think that's it's overrated.
Yeah.
But
Let's bracket that for
this is
discussion.
the wonderful little book. Amazing book.
Beautiful.
Amazing.
Oh, wow. That's not
And
a
yet,
first edition.
most philosophers, most human scientists don't know this work. I don't understand it. This is one of the most creative efforts done in the 20th century. And
truly,
it's not known.
Yeah.
Now, getting to philosophy, of course, as you know, in the 2000s, it's very interesting that you have philosophers like Edward Casey and Jeff Malpass suddenly doing the philosophy of place through a phenomenological perspective. So even though the geographers had lost track of it because they'd gone into post-structuralism and deconstruction and assemblage theory and all that post-structural stuff.
That's more the reduction.
So interesting that the philosophers are coming back to place. And of course, now what we talk about is lived emplacement. And that's one way to hold on to the integrity of the dialectic between inside and outside.
Yeah, so we already, this is really the crux of it in a way, is the part and the whole and the different ways of seeing it and the different ways of talking about it. And I think that's where we're going to get to relating phenomenology and Alexander. But first, maybe, so you came into it and there was the phenomenology, that side of it appealed to you, but you've also kind of created that, at least from my reading of it. You've sort of brought that into human geography and you have your own way of talking about phenomenology, which is very much linked to place. So could we look at that a little bit? How did that develop and how do you see that? Like, how do you really think about phenomenology?
Well, of course, I'm seen as a maverick. Many phenomenologists claim that what I do is not phenomenological.
Yes.
And I understand that point of view because I am much more interested in the spirit of phenomenology and allowing the thing to take you where it takes you. So I'm a maverick from that angle. Now, I'm also a maverick among geographers because the whole humanistic phenomenological tradition has largely been left to the side today. It's really not drawn on as themes like power and identity and all of these kinds of things have come to the fore. So
I'm glad you said that, because I was trying to get at that, because it is a different path. Your path doesn't really fit, but at the same time, you're very well cited, well known in architecture and human geography. So actually you have made this path. But for those who are coming from certain traditions, for example, phenomenology in a very particular way, I think it's important that you explain what you've come to understand as phenomenology.
well, as you say, one could say my broadest interest is the phenomenology of wholeness. And that goes back to lying on the plank and realize this interconnectedness among myself and the world at hand. Now, there's some work in phenomenology on wholeness, but really not very much. The central work on this topic is Henri Bortoft's work, The Wholeness of Nature. And that's a remarkable effort to look phenomenologically at what wholeness is.
Can I just say a quote from your paper that I just wrote down?
Sure.
From Bortoft, which is talking about wholes and parts, and that they're present in intrinsic interdependence and therefore non-separability. If the whole becomes present within its parts, then a part is a place for the presencing of the whole. This is like incredibly beautiful. If a part is a place for the presencing of the whole. I just had to say that, but you can go ahead now.
Well, yes. And you realize that way of attempting to understand the whole is much different from the way that most researchers try to understand the whole today. The whole today continues to be looked at largely in terms of a kind of systems approach, where the whole is envisioned as a set of parts and interconnections. Now, they create some kind of larger system, but even so, that's the dominant understanding of whole today. And the epitome of that would be an engine, yes, or a clock. I mean, that's the model.
Take it apart, reduce it to its parts. That's how you understand
this
it.
piecemeal approach to wholeness. However, when you read Bortoft, you realize he's talking about some other way of encountering the whole. And this is very difficult because in trying to learn this way of encountering, in the moment of encountering, the whole is lost. So it's hard work.
It is hard work. It's hard also, we should say, because it's too easy to go into a kind of mystical place too, because you have the part in the whole. So this is a theme in philosophy, part wholes, and also in bigger kind of themes of how do you talk? You can't talk about the whole without talking about the parts, but you can't talk about the parts without the whole. Or I think some people think it's too mystical to say everything is a whole in science because we need to think of the parts. So there's all kinds of arguments about this, and actually in religions too, how trying to understand a way to talk about that space where you're holding both at once, where both are not real and both are real. And that's the kind of wholeness I think that is this presencing in the parts.
Yes. And it is, I would say that our best guide for moving toward this different way of understanding wholeness is Bortoft's book. I do recommend that book. It's one of the great books of the 20th century. Sadly, it's not that well known, but it is a remarkable work that can totally revamp one's understanding. Now, let me say, back in the early 1970s, I was lucky enough to study with Bortoft for a while.
Oh, wow.
And Henri had the same kind of impact on me as Ann Buttimer. They were both extraordinary minds. And Henri, I saw through Henri that there is another way of encountering. Now, you use the word mystical, and it is important right now to say this is not mystical. There's nothing New Age about it. This is quite real and possible if one works with it. Now, let me give an example of what this kind of wholeness is. And that's the example I mentioned earlier to you before we started. This is from Christopher Alexander's book, The Nature of Order. And it's the drawing of Matisse's, well, it's a set of drawings by Matisse. Now, can this be seen if
I can see words, but I don't see the
you
drawing.
can't see the drawing?
I can see it now. And I'll edit in a picture of it right now so you can just talk about it.
Excellent.
Yep, but I see it.
Now, I want to show this because it does illustrate the quality of wholeness that we're trying to get to. What we have here is 4 self-drawings that Henri Matisse did, the artist and sculptor. And Alexander uses this as an example of the kind of wholeness that he's trying to understand. And what you see here is 4 different drawings. And if you study each one, you'll notice each one is slightly different. But coming out of these 4 drawings is some kind of common personality or presence of Matisse. You begin to feel Matisse's character. And it's that underlying quality where all the lines are connected to evoke this sense of presence of Matisse that is the kind of wholeness that I'm interested in studying. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. He calls it a kind of a vector, doesn't he? Or a field effect.
Yes. Do you mind if I read that? It's so beautiful.
I love it too. No, please read it.
Yes. Alexander says, wholeness is the overall vector. Now that's lovely because you have this sense of impulse coming up through the paper, through the lines, evoking the character of Matisse. You see? And it's all there, but you can't catch it. You can't really grab hold of it, but it is there. You can sense it. You can feel it. You can intuit. Now, see, I don't think you can cognize it. It's
not with the old definition of cognition.
No. All right. So wholeness is the overall vector, the overall qualitative structure, the overall field effect of the face. We see that wholeness is a global thing. Now, by global, he means here the whole of the drawing. We see that wholeness is a global thing, easy to feel perhaps, but hard to define. You cannot get the portrait of a person right unless you can see the underlying wholeness. In portraiture, as in architecture, it is the wholeness that is the real thing that lies beneath the surface and determines everything. So that's what we're trying to get at. Now, another example of this kind of wholeness is brought forward by the physicist David Bohm when he talks about implicate and explicate order. And as you probably know, his example of the explicate order, the implicate order is the hologram.
Yeah.
Whereas the explicate order is the photograph. Now, there are very interesting differences here. In a photograph, you take a picture of a landscape and it becomes the photograph on the paper. So if there's a tree in the center of the landscape, you have a tree in the center of the photograph. If there's a stone gate on the right, you have that over on the right side of the piece of paper. So all the parts have their own region in the whole. Now, holograms are interesting because every little piece of a holographic plate contains the full image of the thing being presented holographically. So in every part is the whole, you see? And that's another way of framing this difference. The photograph, the old systems approach to the whole. The holograph, this new, what Henri Bortoft calls authentic wholeness.
Or the presencing of the parts, I think, too. For me, it also speaks to this, something that I think about a lot, about how we confuse the model with a dynamic ongoing process. somehow with the holograph or with the idea of wholeness that we're talking about here, it's still a dynamic process. We're not trying to freeze it and like a photograph or something. It's in a way what we're trying to do is sort of get a sense of it through sketching it with words, but we're not trying to define it or hold it with those words or images or whatever. And a holograph, these give us ways of understanding that it's dynamic and ongoing. And I think that also speaks a bit to Christopher Alexander and the pattern that he's describing and the importance of movement. And also it speaks to this, what you've written about with place and place making as something that's dynamic and all of the parts presencing within all the other parts sort of at the same time. But does that sound familiar?
Well, of course, that becomes the very, very difficult question. How do we make this new approach to wholeness useful? And this is a very hard question. Now, I like Alexander because I think he has done that in many different ways in his work. Back in the 1970s, he wrote pattern language. And pattern language is a remarkable effort to facilitate a way of envisioning a place that one wants to make. Let's say it's a small school for young children. Pattern language is a method, keeping the whole in sight, to begin to see what architectural and environmental parts that whole should bring forward. So Alexander's work is very significant in offering one model for.
Yeah, he does two things for me. I wonder what you think about this. There's a way in which he reminds us of that it's dynamic and moving, and I think that speaks to your idea of phenomenology trying to keep the wholes whole. I think that's one of your definitions in the paper of phenomenology, and so we can be a point of view within, but we're also dynamic and we're keeping the wholes whole. But here's the two things that his work has done for me so far, or there's many, but it introduces the idea of movement as important, the way you move through the space as a movement, the way the space moves. I mean, you can always flip and look at different ways, but he doesn't just say that, right? Because as you said, it's about how is it useful and how do we not become just mystical, which is fine too, but this is a different conversation. But he kind of mathematizes it. I mean, there's an actual kind of way of systematizing it, but he doesn't stick it to that model the way that often happens with reductionism, where it's only got to be this one way. He says it's situated within every environment. All of this is going to shift. Does that sound right to you, or is that my own interpretation?
Well, no, I agree. Certainly, interconnectedness through movement is an integral part of what he's trying to generate, because as you're suggesting, one quality of place that keeps place alive is dynamic, particularly people moving in some way. Of course, not all places can have powerful movement. You know, you want places of rest.
Mm-hmm.
When I was writing a geography of the life world, I remember the moment I suddenly realized, oh my God, you know, you need movement, but you need rest. And
Important point.
again, we have another dialectic that has to be held in sight and somehow not regulated, but harmonized. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
For
I
me,
think
it's a
you're
different
talking.
kind of movement. I mean, you can be moved by a place without the place moving or your body moving. So I think there's a lot of different scales at which movement can be assessed. But what you're saying is very important. It's not that everything is dynamic and moving in the sense of busy or, with a lot going on. It's more that it's not, even when you're quiet and at rest, those environments are changing. The light maybe is changing. And, there's always something kind of going, but it doesn't, as you point out importantly, it doesn't mean that you're not resting or it's not busy. Those are
Well, and
important things to hold.
this would be a wonderful dissertation topic. We don't really have a phenomenology of movement in human life. And as you're pointing out, there's such a range of experiential possibility. Now, the only person I know of who's begun to deal with this is Ed Casey. in his, which is it? Is it Getting Back into Place? I think he has a section on this. Or it may be The Fate of Place. Can't remember which one, but he does talk about this there. But there's so much more possibility and richness. And of course, then you move into the question, okay, now how do you manipulate the material world to enhance the quality of movement that you're talking about? You see, we fall back into that inside-outside connectedness again.
Right, or trying to figure out how we can look at it from different positions. We could look at it from the position of the light, but I mean, that would be a whole other discussion. But yeah, it's in a way the phenomenology is opening up a way of doing that, even though it almost seems contradictory. But once you can allow for the phenomenological experience, you can also start to understand that from other different positions in this room, for example, where we're resting. I'm imagining the Mark Rothko Chapel for some reason.
Right.
In this room where we're resting, we could, from very different positions, experience it differently, so to speak. So there is no final kind of point of assessment, right? That's a very Bohm kind of idea too. That relates a lot to all of this too. There's a lot of different levels that we could look at these ideas on. But more importantly, is this coming back to your work and how this is a different idea of place.
Well, my most recent work has been interested in trying to understand place processually. And this goes back to David Bohm. I don't know if you remember, but David Bohm has these wonderful drawings of what he calls world tubes. And a world tube is a particular situation moving through time, and he draws them as tubes. So I thought, well, we could talk about place tubes, how a place changes over time. And that became the key question in my book, Life Takes Place.
Exactly. Right.
And you've already mentioned the 6 place processes. And this became the key question in that book. Are there interconnected processes whereby places become stronger, they become weaker, they stay more or less the same? And I identified 6 of these processes, largely through the systematics method of J.G. Bennett, the English philosopher, who's another very important figure in my work, by the way.
Yeah, but there's place interaction, your 6 place interaction, place identity, release. I'd actually like if you talked about place release. I really like that one. Place intensification.
On place realization.
Realization comes before, then intensification, then creation. Did I get it?
Yeah. Do you see why I put intensification and the creation last?
I see. I think I always confuse the intensification and the realization, but you realize, and then that awareness is an intensification, and then you also have agency to create, something like that.
Well, that's part of it. Agency is certainly the key to creation. In place creation, you have people devoted to their place trying to improve it. That's the process. Intensification is interesting because, it provides a place for the material environment to be active in human life. Because what intensification says is that the way we design a particular situation plays a role in how that situation unfolds. So, well, I could say so much about that because most of the courses I teach are about that.
Yeah, I was about to say that would be, you don't have to teach it all here. It's too much.
But getting back to release, I'm so pleased that you find that intriguing.
Now, I wonder where that, maybe you can tell people who've not read it or heard about it yet, what you mean by place release.
Well, it's essentially environmental serendipity. That so much of happy things in life happen because of coincidental meetings in place. So you're walking down the sidewalk and you meet an old friend you haven't seen in 6 months, and you go for coffee, and something very important happens out of that event. So
people are released more deeply into themselves. Sorry, I just found it on the paper.
That's why I use the word
release refers to an environmental serendipity of happenstance encounters. Yeah, people are released more deeply into themselves. This feels like a very good example of serendipity to me. I was just talking with Mike Levin. I don't know if you know his work or something, but he talks about synchronicities as also, and serendipities as also probably being more important than we think, just in terms of a really practical, um, biological understanding of, or being in the place that we're in too. So I really love this. Did that just come to you, or is there how did you get there with the serendipity?
Well, of course, this gets into the whole justification of six processes. And
Okay.
as you may remember, I draw on J.G. Bennett's
Mm,
systematics of the event. And he argues that in any event, and by an event, he means a situation which has continuing significance through time.
mm.
It's a very interesting idea, this idea of event.
Yeah,
I
it's the
think you can
tube
find it in
again in a
Whitehead
way.
too, but I don't know Whitehead well enough to
Yeah.
be able to tell you
Whitehead
that.
fits very well with the process. And they're
Yeah.
all trying to, again, I think it's like back to what we were saying. There's these ways in which people use language and images to try to kind of say what you can't say or present an image or language. But somehow it again relates to patterning of Alexander. You're expressing something that's in the patterning and in the kind of explanation without specifically explaining or saying it somehow.
Well, and I think place release is a very useful way to get ordinary people thinking about the significance of place in their lives. Because you say to somebody, okay, well, now just think about this for a little bit. Can you think of a serendipitous event that happened because of place? And it's remarkable what people come up with.
It is.
You
Yeah.
know, so
Pretty much.
many folks met their significant other this way.
Yeah. Including me. Yeah.
So many people, their professional career was determined. I mean,
And
I can see that.
can you?
Um,
Yeah, you just did kind of in a way, these people that you met. Yeah.
well, no,
In
but it
particular
actually the
places.
first moment was sitting on the bus going from old campus to new campus, and this young fellow was standing in the aisle with his girlfriend, and he said, "I think I'll go to summer school." And I thought, "Whoa, that's a good idea. I never thought of
Ah,
doing that." So I went to summer school, and lo and behold, guess what course I took? My first geography class
geography. Wow.
with a fellow named Stanley Bloud, who happened to be living in the dormitory that summer because he just moved there to become chair of the department. And he and I would have dinner almost every night. So he took an
Wow.
interest in me. So he was my
Set the
first
course,
mentor.
set the trajectory
Yeah, my
from
first
just
mentor.
overhearing something in the bus, right? And you'll never forget that bus and where you were standing. And I think you're right. It does open up to place as inextricable from all of these other things. We tend to think of it as separate, but yeah, something so seemingly small kind of orients your life. And I think we can all, for a moment, sit here and realize actually that probably the most important orientations came from something like that, some geographical place we were that we just happened to overhear
Yes.
something, or someone just happened to say something, or whatever.
Yes. And of course, that's only one of the processes.
And that's only
You
one.
know,
I know.
because identity, so much of how we see ourselves as being is grounded in the place where we are. Now, obviously, if you're mobile, that's going to change, but I think the figure today is still 96% of the Earth's population remain in the place where they were born, pretty much. 96%.
It's a very
You
big
know,
percent.
rootedness, being at home, being in place. It's one of the great stabilizing phenomena of the Earth,
Yeah,
really,
it is.
when you think
Place
about it.
identity and how much that becomes your resource and reference without you knowing it in a way. You're always
Yes,
dipping into that well. That was actually a whole other conversation I thought we could have, was how that's changed, if it's changing due to things like, virtual spaces and whatever. But that's another thing we have to bracket for another time. But actually all six of them are really interesting. And to go back to the paper and link some of these things together a bit, in the paper you are talking about what we've been talking about, but about this idea of wholeness and how it's often approached in what you call the analytic relationality, which is this, I think, this way that is more common, where we reduce things to their parts, and that's kind of how it's done. But you also have another idea which relates more, I think, to all these other ideas we're talking about now, which is the synergistic relationality. So what do you mean by the synergistic relationality? Or I could
well,
try.
synergistic reality is this other way of understanding wholeness that we've been talking about. And that's why I wanted to show those 4 drawings by Matisse, because it's that underlying vector coming forward, which is the possibility of wholeness as synergistic relationality. Now, the dilemma here is learning how to see in this new way. This is why Henri Bortoft in The Wholeness of Nature gives so much time to Goethe. Could I say a bit about Goethe?
Yeah, sure.
Goethe is so crucial here.
That was a big
Probably,
influence on you too, right? Early
yes.
on.
And probably most of your listeners, when they hear Goethe, they think of Faust, they think of poetry. And it is true that Goethe was one of the great poets and playwrights. But curiously, Goethe did a great amount of what he called scientific work. But if we look back on the work that he did today, we realize that what he was doing was an early phenomenology of the natural world. And when I'm introducing phenomenology to new students, this issue comes up. The student will say, well, okay, you want us to study phenomena, but how do we know that we're in accurate contact with the phenomenon? And this is a huge dilemma in all phenomenological work. You can see too much, you can read too much into the phenomenon. And let me tell you, there's a lot of phenomenological work like that today, a lot of gibberish. Or you don't see enough. So how do you know you're accurately encountering the phenomenon? This is a huge dilemma. And when I'm introducing phenomenology, we start out with some exercises from a book by Goethe called Theory of Colors. And one of the exercises in that book is looking through a prism at the appearance of colors. And this is a very useful exercise because you see, you have a phenomenon that you can see, but you can't manipulate it. It's there, it's in front of you. So you have to stay with it. And at first, people make up all sorts of concoctions about what they're seeing. I see color around all the objects. Well, no, you don't. That's not true. So you have to begin to actually look in an active way. This is a very important part of this approach to wholeness, that you have to look actively. And this takes great practice. We're not used to looking actively. So as you begin looking, you begin to realize, well, certain colors seem to be associated with certain edges. And then you begin to see that certain colors cluster together in these edges. So your darker colors of blue, indigo, and violet, they cluster together. Your lighter colors of yellow, orange, and red cluster together. You don't often see green. You see a new color like magenta. So it's really all quite a puzzle, but you can't, because it's there in front of you, you can keep going back to it until you begin to know that what you're describing is an accurate rendition of what you're seeing. You see, so we begin to recognize how difficult it is to study any phenomenon. Now, the other thing that Goethe did in Theory of Color, which is very interesting, he said, once you've mastered what you've seen, and you can picture it well in your head, what I want you to do is to recreate it visually without looking at it. This is what he called exact sensorial imagination. You see, so everything he's doing is providing a method for moving more and more closely to the actual phenomenon. And that's something which, frankly, phenomenologists haven't dealt with very well. We have these highfalutin notions like epoche and imaginative variation, but so often those approaches, which come out of Searle mostly, they lead to a lot of embellishment and muddle. And I'm much against embellishment and muddle.
Does this have to do with the generative? Because it's a word that's used in Alexander a lot, the idea of the generative aspects and the generative fields. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about this generative, intensive, integrative, these words that you use, but I'm also thinking about just something like awareness and how that practice that you described is in a way getting you to look, it's changing your interaction, it's changing the way you're interacting with the place, the object, so that it's becoming clear. And somehow it's that interaction. I guess that gets to place interaction too a bit, but it's somehow there's something about awareness. I don't know. What do you think about generative and then awareness? How do those
Well,
two?
well, it's true. Alexander, too, is making the effort to facilitate new ways of looking at design possibilities to make the environment better for the people who are going to be living in it or using it in some way. Did I lose you?
I
You've
think
dis
your screen is frozen. Is mine frozen? I can't
well,
see.
yeah.
I can't see you at all now.
I see your picture. That's all I see. Cannot start video. Failed to start the video camera. Please
Hmm.
select another video camera in the settings. Sorry, I think the camera is kaput.
It's okay. Why don't you just keep your camera off then? Maybe it just needs
Yeah,
to rest.
okay. Okay.
Um, yeah, but I do think I do. Yeah, I mean to get towards yeah, kind of bringing it together a bit. Yeah, what do you think about Alexander? What is he trying to? I mean, it's a bit too much to say he's the book and the work is a practice towards better awareness, but it does feel like a practice a little bit in a way of
Oh, it is.
yeah.
Yes.
How would you talk about that practice?
Well, it certainly, he's offering a way to understand in a new way. But as an architect, he's also offering a way to design in a different way. And Alexander believes that the built environment makes a huge difference in human life, that people will become better if the designed environment is better. And he's quite discouraged by the state of the physical environment today. You know, when you look at downtown areas, you look at suburban sprawl,
Hmm.
you look at the destruction brought by climate change. We are in a pickle.
I think I want to just highlight something before we move towards closing, and that is this idea of place and how important it is. Exactly what you're saying now. There's, how do I really say this? There's something about changing our orientation to the way we understand place and realizing that it's a phenomenological experience that has everything to do with health, not only of our inside as individuals, our experience as selves, but of our, there's a scaled or a nestedness in Alexander, and I think in your work too, of yes, there's the phenomenological experience of this body, but also the way it scales to your home and that environment, the room, let's even say, and then the home, and then the city, and then the neighborhood. And, you know, there's a way in which it touches something like the issues that we're facing as a planet at some point, and not in a very practical way. And when you read his books, also, I think you go towards that a lot. So, maybe this moves towards the idea of environmental humility a little bit too. How do you see that? The idea of nestedness, and also just, I want to underline this idea of place as an experience and place as something, not only like the place release where the synchronicity changes us, but really every aspect of our life is place in a way. And that is kind of what you're expressing in a lot of different ways with place making, place ballet, and there's all these ways you come at it, but there's a feeling of this intimacy of everything interacting as place that I feel like is really important and that we haven't drawn out really yet.
Well, I think what we're pointing toward is a entirely new way of understanding what human being is, that human being is not human being alone. Human being is human being in place. And if we can recognize this new way of realizing what we are, we realize that an integral part of place is the others in the place. So it is I do think it's a different vision And I think it's related to what you're attempting to do with your cognitive work. What is your expression, waymaking?
Yeah.
And that's part of it too, that who we are is the way we make our way, you know?
Yeah, I think we're all, and many different people from many different angles, and it's all needed, are trying to do what we've been trying to do in this conversation, which is hold what we've thought of till now as parts and wholes as something that we can't really express because it doesn't fit into either of those categories. It's not that they're opposites either. So we're even trying to open up that space a bit. Or do you see analytic and synergistic relationality as opposites?
Well, I wouldn't call them opposites. I'm not really interested in analytic relationality because that's really the tradition that I broke free from back in the 1970s when I discovered phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that analytic relationality does largely dominate the sciences today, um, because it's easier to master, it's convenient, it gives one a sense of power that one can mark out the parts of a thing and manipulate it. And so much of analytic relationality involves manipulating and controlling,
Mm-hmm.
whereas synergistic relationality involves the empathy of phenomenology, trying to be open to the thing, just allowing the thing to be, but doing it with care, doing it in a directed way that I was suggesting when I was talking about the prism exercises that Goethe offers. So I wouldn't call them opposites. I mean, they are opposite in some ways, but they're simply very much different.
Yes, and I guess there's been so much focus on the analytic that you're sort of bringing out the synergistic, but there's
Well,
also
and I
this,
think
yeah.
there are situations where analytic relationality is quite good. I mean, obviously, I immediately think of surgery, and knowing the body if something needs to be removed. Those are the situations where analytic relationality is crucial. Um, Taking care of the wounded, all that kind of thing, where there has to be an understanding of the part that's damaged. So I mean, I don't want to suggest I'm against analytic relationality. It has its place.
Mm-hmm.
But as McGilchrist says, it's become so dominant. And
Yeah.
of course, he associates it with the poor left brain,
Mm-hmm.
which, okay, I mean, I don't go along with that so much because I find it physicalist, but I like his work, whereas he associates the so-called synergistic relationality with the right brain, yeah, or
Right.
the right hemisphere. So you see this difference in his work too, though I haven't studied his work that thoroughly as you have.
Yeah, I think he's trying to do something similar to hold the space. I mean, I wrote about it as asymmetrical reconciliation in your environmental and architectural phenomenology, because I think we can all kind of look at ways we might have expressed it differently or better, but when you look at the bigger picture, it is, I think, trying to do something similar to open the space so that, yes, there are times we need to be reductionist in a way or look at things, the parts, as parts, even if it's only in our models. But there's a way in which now we have the capacity to look at this synergistic relationality or the right brainness, if you want to call it that, whatever way you want to come at it, as very important right now in this place that we're in and as needing nurturing, I guess, something like that. And I think you express it with belonging or belonging together, in some of your work. I
Well,
think
of
that's
course,
another way at it.
that gets us into Heidegger.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another interesting way of talking about the difference between these two ways of understanding. Heidegger talks about belonging together, where the emphasis is on the togetherness. And he contrasts that with belonging together, where the emphasis is on the belonging. And ultimately, he suggests that the belonging emphasis is more real because the togetherness happens because there's belonging to begin with. And this is a theme that Henri Bortoft picks up on considerably in his writings.
Right.
And we can go back to the Matisse drawings. There's an underlying belonging. It's that underlying vector, which we can talk about in terms of belonging, which leads to this presence of Matisse's character.
Yes, I think that you showed the pictures, and I think that gives us a good example of how you can't define that vector or that field effect by reducing it to the parts, but we know it immediately. And it's similar with the place too. You experience this field effect or this vector or this synergistic relationality as the place. There's no separating it, but sometimes we need to separate it into parts to understand it better. And those are just very different processes. And I guess, yeah.
Well, I think we have to be very careful here, but we're not saying that it can never be understood. What we're saying is we have to be very careful about the ways that we find to understand it. So Alexander has developed a whole series of possibilities. His pattern language, his 15 geometrical qualities. In my work, I'm arguing that the wholeness of place processually can be understood in terms of those 6 interconnected processes. So we are trying to move toward some kind of greater understanding, but the key is that we have to put the phenomenon first. Yeah, that's the key.
Good point, yes.
So let me just say, one of the reasons we publish environmental and architectural phenomenology is to keep track of this kind of work. And sadly, the academic realm is very bad about being interested in these alternative ways of understanding. Bortoft's work, for example, I don't understand why the philosophers don't pick up on it, but they don't. There's such hostility toward Bortoft, I suppose because his original training was not in philosophy, but whatever. There's wonderful work going on, and we try to keep track of that work in the environmental and architectural phenomenology newsletter, which has been published since 1990. And as you know, well, you've just published 2 reviews of McGilchrist for me. They're quite lovely reviews, by the way.
Thanks for the opportunity to dig into it. It was good for me.
Yeah, I was so happy because I
And
wanted
I love,
somebody to cover him, and finally I found you.
I love EAP too. I really think of it, I have this waymaking and looking at navigability, and I really think of it as you said, you've opened up this path and this trajectory that is really important. I mean, keeping this visible, all these different other ways. And I guess I want to come back. We have to go now, but I want to come back to you as a little boy in that place. And I wonder if it's not that you were trying to answer what that was, but I wonder how you see that experience now after all this work that you've done. And I also kind of just want to get a little bit at what motivated you? Was it that kind of moment, or I guess I'm trying to get towards this real kindness in a way, where you also in the paper, because I think it's a really beautiful notion. And you mentioned the other before too, with this humility of, who is it, Relph, or
Environmental humility, yes.
So I don't know. I'm throwing a bunch of stuff out there, but I want to hear about how you see that moment that that started it all, and also what you see this as really doing in the world.
Well, that moment on the plank had to do with realizing that there was a way to see accurately, a way of understanding something real. And it's that wish to really understand in a real way that's really driven me along my entire professional career. I think I can honestly say that I've never written anything that I don't believe in. I've always tried to write from a reality. And I think it's that feeling that there is a reality that that pulls me along.
That's a good way to say it. Have you encountered resistance trying to do that? Because it almost sounds like something that's, I think for younger people listening, you want to do that with your life. You want to stay in that real place and do it, but it doesn't always seem like it fits with academia.
Well, I have experienced resistance, and my major advice there is to keep your head down. If you look at my academic career, it's been largely on the periphery of geography, the periphery of phenomenology and philosophy, the periphery of environment behavior research. I've always been on the periphery, and I've always sought out others who were on the periphery, like Bob Mugerauer and Ingrid Stefanovich, Ann Buttermer,
Mm-hmm.
Yves Tuan. There are
Wonderful,
so many
wonderful
of them,
scholars, though.
in between. And sadly, the in between is largely ignored by the conventional academic folks. But I think that's a good thing because I've been given the space to do what I can do. So I don't regret it.
No, and I don't think it's peripheral anymore. It's just that the time scale is a bit different. So in the moment, there's an inertia in academia that publishes certain things, and certain things get prioritized. But all those names that you just said, and including yours, actually at this stage are very influential. And there are these trajectories now. So you were working in an interstitial in-betweenness in your career, bringing in all these at the edge of all these places, but somehow you sort of sewed those edges into another path, I'd say, with the help of a lot of the people that you've mentioned in this
Yes, I
discussion.
remember Bob Mugerauer saying once, he said, David, we've got to create our own center.
Mm.
And I thought, well, yeah, okay.
Well,
And in a way that has happened, though I still think that this work is poorly known. For example, Ian McGilchrist, none of this work is covered in his writings. Why is that? This work is much more important than most of the stuff he covers. I don't even think he knows Christopher Alexander's work, does he?
now he does, because I told him. But I
Well,
think,
I know, but how can that be? You see,
but I
how
don't
can
think
he
you can
not
blame
know
people for
Goethe?
that, because
How
we
can he not
only.
know Alexander? How can he not know Bortoft?
I don't think, yeah,
Just,
I didn't either, David, till I met you. I mean, I knew, maybe I had heard of Christopher Alexander because of the software thing, but
well,
we can't blame people for what they don't know, because you can only imagine from what you've learned and what you know. And that's, as you've shown, largely a matter of all these kind of place processes. And until you get a kind of agency to really start trying to connect dots and patterns that aren't your predictable patterns, it's hard to know what you don't know. I know it's hard to. But this right now we're making a connection, and this will, a lot of people will now hear about these people, and it spreads fast once it spreads.
well, yes. I guess the only point I'm making is I still think we're somewhat at the periphery. Okay, that's
Okay, well, you can be at the periphery. That's not a bad place to be. And anyway, the center is everywhere. So it's just, for you, these things are central, and that is a center, and more people will start to discover that. So yeah, when that
see.
happens, how that happens is.
But you see, what puzzles me is that take Bortoft, for example, his work is extraordinary. And yet, extraordinary work is not getting the attention. So something is wrong there. People are
Mhm.
not really in touch with reality. It gets back to that again.
But you could say that about a lot of the people that have influenced the world. I mean, sometimes you have people who make an influence in their lifetime and immediately, but quite often, I mean, even with a lot of phenomenology, it seems like it is huge to us now, but it's also been a rather peripheral experience until lately. So,
Well, that's true,
yeah.
yes.
So
But it is curious how folks who to me are pretty much useless, let's say Derrida, for example, how people like that get so much attention, and yet they're writing nonsense, you see, and yet the good work gets ignored. This is what I find disturbing. And sometimes I become discouraged about it because I say, people are so readily overwhelmed by embellishment and concoction.
I think there's something about the spectacle and about being this kind of loudness, or there's also something about a violence or a deconstructive kind of approach that
Yes.
when you're young gets your attention more than. But then I would say it's moving the other way too. I really just think there are waves of this, because I do see a lot of people now wanting the more um, wholeness approach. It's just that's a lot harder to talk about, And it's
Yes.
much more of a practice. It's easier to talk about reduction and it's easier to show it. So I think the time scale and also just what we're capable of, being able to, with wholeness, you have to be able to hold contradiction and seeming paradox. And yeah, it's just it takes a different kind of patience and time, I think. That's what it gets down to. And you were lucky that you found a community of people doing that early on. So for you, it's felt natural, but a lot of people don't find that early on. They find the reduction. So,
Yes. Well, there are so few communities like that,
yeah, but
especially
I
in
do think
today's
there's becoming
world.
more, even if it's through
Oh,
something
good.
like,
That's encouraging to hear. That's
yeah,
good.
I really do think so. And, that's why your work is important because all it takes is people to start looking and then they can find it. That's why you need to leave the trail as you have. So that's the best we can do, really. And also try
Ah,
to live it in our own lives, I guess. That's a big way of spreading it, which it sounds like you do. It's a flowering, an unfolding.
well, yes. And that really has been my major aim, just to get this work out there through my writing. And I think I've done a pretty good job of that.
I think you have. That's how I found you. So
Yeah.
it's working. It's
Hey,
just,
I
you
did
have
want to
to.
ask you that. How did we meet? I was trying to think and I couldn't
I
remember.
honestly don't know how we met, but I'm sure it was because I read your book, Life World, the first book.
So
Um,
you think you sent me an email first?
I'm
Huh.
sure I reached out to you because
Okay.
I think I was looking for ways. I was having ideas about how this connects to place and cities, and
Okay.
and I think I found you that way. So you're
Okay.
present. And
And
I
how
thank
did
you
I
for your
talk
work.
you into doing those reviews?
I have no idea how we got onto all that. I think just from our discussions, maybe we were
I'm so
discussing.
happy you did
Yeah,
them. Oh, it's
yeah,
very nice to have those reviews.
yeah. I'm so glad that happened too. I'm definitely glad I found you and your work. So, and I
Good.
thank you for it. And just if I hope that you can just feel that it is important and not get too discouraged because yeah, there's a lot of meaning in it and it's been worth it and it's still worth it. So,
Well, it's a curious thing, because there is a part of me discouraged, but there's this much more powerful part that says, who cares?
yeah, go with that part. It's
Going.
it's good to care a little bit, but look at this. I
Yeah.
mean, you really have this trail of very substantial work and connections and community, and that's the most that anyone can ever really want. And as you said, you were always doing it from a real place. I mean, that you can say that is really precious, I think, in such an environment that we live in now. So,
Well, thank you for saying that.
yeah, I really mean it. And I hope other people hear it and feel inspired to live their life like that. But I think we should probably wrap it up. Is there anything we didn't say or touch on that you really want to make sure is in here for this?
No, I would just, could I mention a few of the best works I would suggest that folks read?
Yeah, please do.
And I would start out with Henri Bortoft's The Wholeness of Nature, which was originally published in 1996. I would recommend Edward Ralph's Place and Placelessness, written in 1976, which was the first phenomenology of place written back in the 70s. I would recommend all of Christopher Alexander's work, but if viewers haven't looked at pattern language, they must look at it. It's really one of the most creative efforts that anyone has ever assembled. And then I would recommend the more recent work on phenomenology of place. Edward Casey's Getting Back into Place, which was originally published in 1993 and then made a second edition in 2009, is a wonderful work, as is Jeff Malpas's Place and Experience. There's a new edition of that, which was just published in 2018. I hope folks might look at my work. Life Takes Place was published in 2018. There's a very early work, A Geography of the Life World, published in 1979. And then I just published a collection of my past writings called Phenomenological Perspectives on Place, Life Worlds, and Lived Emplacement. So
Wonderful.
those are some of the works I would highlight.
I'll put links to all that in the show notes and also in the comments and
Oh,
section on
wonderful.
YouTube. So
Thank
people
you.
can
Oh, and of
easily find
course,
it.
environmental and architectural phenomenology, all of those issues are online. They've all been
Yeah, it's
uploaded. So if
wonderful
you
open
Google
source. I'll
it,
definitely link to that too.
Yeah, I think it's great fun going through those, and just amazing what we've covered over the years.
Really, it really is. And I really do think Christopher Alexander is probably the key. I mean, I think that's where people can start getting hooked and really get into this, because
Yes,
there's so much in that, and it really relates to a lot that a lot of people are already interested in right now in this moment. And it's a mind-opening way to think of the world. All right, well, I hope you
a
have a
great
great day
pleasure.
there. It's been
Thank you.
lovely.
Yes, goodbye.
Bye.